Welcome to Now in the 90s, where we look at the game releases of 30 years ago today. This week, we've got an inexplicably hardcore game of pinball, an attempted cartoon franchise, and an adaptation of a classic board game. I'm your host, Jared, and today is July 29th, 1992. Pinball was a big thing in the 80s, and going into the 90s, it started to slow a bit as less and less people wanted to go out and actually play it, which is why more and more pinball video games were made, like this week's first release, Dragon's Fury for the Sega Genesis, this week in 1992. Dragon's Fury is a pinball game that isn't based on a physical pinball table, meaning they could do whatever they want with it and go buck wild. And that they did. They leaned hard into the metal part of the game, as it's filled with imagery of devils, demons, dragons, and skulls. Unlike most other pinball games or tables, Dragon's Fury is filled with enemies that spawn to 1. Get in your way, and 2. To be additional targets to rack up some points. There are also a few bonus stages that you can get into that give boss fights of sorts. A very small portion of you may actually recognize this game from a different place under a different name, because Dragon's Fury on the Genesis is actually a port of Devil's Crush on the TurboGrafx 16. Naturally, a lot of changes were made to the Genesis version, besides the name change. It actually got some graphical improvements, like more frames of animation and more information on a sidebar. However, it also got censored compared to the original. Any and all pentagrams were changed to stars, probably because they were too satanic, which makes less sense when you look at the backgrounds of the bonus levels. Some of these are pretty extreme, or in the case of the Hydra Fight bonus level, the Genesis one is just more visually busy to show off them Sega graphics. Gameplay-wise, it's pinball alright. Kinda disappointing is that there is only one table for you to play on. Still, it did get positive reviews. Mega Play magazine generally liked it, although I do want to point out that one reviewer who didn't care for the demonic imagery and called out that it's just a port of Devil's Crush. Dragon's Fury, or Devil's Crush, whichever you prefer at this point, is actually the second title in this series of pinball games, all called blank Crush. The first one was Alien Crush in 1988 for the TurboGrafx 16, and the third is Jockey Crush for the Super Famicom in Japan. Also, the third one is Dragon's Revenge for the Sega Genesis, but Dragon's Revenge was made by a developer who had nothing to do with Devil's Crush or the Dragon's Fury port. It's like a split in the timeline. Anyway, there was one more game in the series. Alien Crush returns as a Nintendo WiiWare title. Not a virtual console game, a WiiWare title, and that one even had motion controls. The NES also got an all-new game this week in 1992, and it was called Defenders of Dynatron City. Defenders of Dynatron City is a beat-em-up game of sorts about superheroes, all with bizarre powers, such as Jet Headstrong, who can fire his rocket head, Buzzsaw Girl, the Atomic Radium Dog, Miss Megawatt with lightning powers, and Monkey Kid, who is a monkey kid. After choosing one of the 5, you then go through the streets of Dynatron City, defeating evil robots, and can explore the interior of buildings and navigating a surprisingly big city map. It's more like a scavenger hunt of figuring out how to progress. It was developed by LucasArts, who at the time was most known for their adventure games such as Monkey Island and Indiana Jones. But Defenders of Dynatron City wasn't just a weird game for them, oh no, it was a multimedia initiative. Premiered on February 22nd, 1992, Defenders of Dynatron City, the cartoon, was given a pilot episode on Fox Kids from Deke Animation. In this city, people love nuclear energy so much, they literally drink it because it's normal here to mutate yourself left and right. And they really tried with it too, getting star power with Whoopi Goldberg as the voice of Miss Megawatt and Tim Curry as the voice of the evil Adam Ed, the floating head, and Christopher Walken was to be in the show, but had all his recorded lines replaced, no one's sure why, and it only ever got 1 episode. At the same time as that, Defenders of Dynatron City, the comic book, was being released. This one was made by Marvel and lasted 6 issues, lasting just long enough for the launch of the video game. None of them succeeded. Nobody watched the cartoon, Fox didn't want to pay for it, nobody read the Marvel comics, and the video game sucked. It plays like ass with slippery movement on everyone and awful hit detection. It's also one of those NES games that what we call is Nintendo hard. Reviews at the time were a bit kinder than I am. GamePro and Games and Computer Entertainment magazines both praised it for its novel idea of some original superheroes, but that the game didn't really do anything special. And I can't think of anyone who actually had this game as a kid, let alone played it. I guess we just weren't enticed enough by Tim Curry back then. Speaking of Tim Curry, how about something he was actually in? Also released this week in 1992 was Clue for the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis.
There's been a murder.
Oh, he's dead, he is.
It's a classic game of Clue. Who done it, where they done it, and with which weapon they done it with.
I say it was in the kitchen with the wrench by Miss Scarlet.
He's dead in the library, you old geezer, with a bloody lead pipe.
Nice.
Oh, right. Knife in his back. The killer is Mr. Green.
Well, it could have been someone else.
Oh, I'd say so.
A game of Clue.
First introduced over 70 years ago, Clue is one of the most popular board games of all time. And Clue, the video game, is just that, a recreation of Clue. Or if you live outside of the US, Cluedo. If you're unfamiliar with Clue, a body was discovered in a big old mansion, and you must use the clues you have to determine who the killer was, what the weapon used was, and where. Now I'll give the game credit, as they did try to spice it up with some nifty animations. There are well-animated intro sequences, and of the different characters using the different weapons. There's also a hand that comes up to roll the dice. This same hand animation would also be used for Monopoly, also on the SNES and the Sega Genesis. There really isn't much else to say about Clue. I guess if you really want to play the board game, you can just play with computer opponents, because playing with other human players would make no sense, because you can see everyone else's cards, allowing anyone to immediately determine the winning result and just race to the finish. They didn't really think that part through. There's also no music while you play, except for when making accusations, and the only real sound effect is dice rolling and moving. It's the whole game of Clue, only much more lonely than, say, playing a video game version of Clue by yourself with computer players. There were game magazine reviews of Clue at the time as well, but there's no point in going over them because I can tell you what they all said. It sure is Clue, but on your console. Yay! Also released this week was Sports Talk Baseball on the Sega Genesis. It's exactly what it sounds like. Baseball, but with play-by-play commentary with a real voice. A real robot voice. This means this week we had a total of 5 games released. 1 Super Nintendo game, 1 NES game, and 3 Sega Genesis games. That is, if you count Clue as a game. Over in the collector's corner, nobody cares about Clue. It's less than $10 at a loose copy, and just under $25 complete on the Super Nintendo. But the Sega Genesis version is only $10 for a complete one. Dragon's Fury, on the other hand, goes for just under $40 for a loose cartridge, and just under $70 at complete. Which, for a pinball game, not bad. Defenders of Dynatron City has solid value for being an obscure NES title. The cartridge by itself is worth about $50, and with the box and manual, it's worth $100. This officially makes it the most valuable piece of Defenders of Dynatron City merchandise. And that's it for today. Next week, we have another D&D game, an all-new Mario game, and the debut of a beloved Nintendo character. I'm Jared, and this was Now in the 90s. Thank you for watching Now in the 90s. Please like the video and subscribe if you aren't already. And if you are already a subscriber, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who's been coming by every single week to watch this. It really means a lot. Were there any games in here that you've never heard of and never seen in your entire life, like Defenders of Dynatron City? Oh my God, I actually own that. I actually own the game.